Hello everybody and welcome again to chesslecture.com. This is International Master Dave Vigorito. Today we are going to be looking at a game where Magnus Carlsen, the world's #1, brings down world champion Viswanathan Anand rather easily in a quiet opening. And this, I think, is the first game that Carlsen actually beat Anand in like a normal classical time control. I think he's beat him in some faster time controls. And this is, it's a bit of a changing of the guard game, because Anand, he's lost a lot of his fire, it seems, since he won the matches against Kramnik and Topalov. It's been a couple of years since he won a big tournament. He barely got by Gelfand in the World Championship match. Gelfand raised his game there, but Anand, has kind of been lacking that spark, it seems. And in this game, Carlsen really shows, his style. And he did this in the whole tournament where he is actually showing like his weakness in some way too, where his openings aren't really kind of as well prepared as maybe somebody like Kramnik or Aronian, but he also is able to, especially with white, just get a position and play it. That's what he does here. So this could be maybe an inspiration to the rest of us that you don't have to have every opening, worked out 30 moves in order to play a good game. So let's jump into the game. Carlsen plays e4, c5, knight f3, d6, and now bishop b5 check. So, of course, he's avoiding the most critical lines, but, he just wants to kind of get a game. And even in this variation, the Moscow variation, they quickly end up out of theory. So Anand played bishop to d7. Maybe Carlsen took into account that Anand a few months earlier played knight d7 against Tivyakov. And Tivyakov's maybe somebody that Anand is going to try to beat, so this move is sharper, but it's riskier. But Anand ended up just trying to play solid and lost a very one-sided game with no counterplay against Tivyakov. So here he plays bishop to d7. The other popular move is knight c6. Bishop takes d7, queen takes, and now c4. And sometimes white plays castles too, but if he wants to get a Marazzi set up, he really needs to play c4 right away, because here black can play knight f6, and then the attack on the e-pawn forces either d3 or knight c3 or rook e1 or queen e2. But both of those moves don't really fit into a Marazzi setup for white. Once white gets a Marazzi setup, we usually just play knight c3 or f3. So by playing c4 first, he's all set to protect the e-pawn, and then play d4. So knight f6, knight c3, g6, d4, takes, bishop to g7. And now it's been known for a while, and I believe we've looked at it here, that if castles, there's some tricks with like rook c8, like f3, rook c8. This is a line of Ivanchuk, where he would play b3 and then d5, kind of a shocking move. But it's quite well known now that this is totally okay for black. White even sometimes has to be a little careful. This is just tactical ideas based on the rook on the knight, the bishop on these knights here. Like, for example, if ed, then even like knight takes d5, knight takes d5, e6 wins back the piece. So this is also the reason that we see black delaying knight c6, is he wants to have this rook c8 trick. So nowadays, players with white generally try to avoid this. One way is to play h3, which was used by Adams a bit. This will allow for bishop e3 without knight g4 coming, but it's probably not so dangerous. And here, Carlsen just plays f3 immediately. So now black can castle, and then if castles, we have rook c8 again. What black is usually trying to avoid is a setup like castles, knight c6, knight e2, and white might play bishop g5, which is just a little annoying because it might provoke h6, which is weakening, and also if knight d5 comes, then there's some pressure on f6 from the d5 knight. So that's kind of the setup black is trying to avoid. So here, black castles, and white does not want to castle now this rook c8. He can play bishop e3, but then black just can play knight c6, and he's not worried about the bishop coming to g5 anymore. So it's hard for white to have it all. But here Anand plays a new idea that I hadn't seen before. He plays queen to c7, just attacking the pawn. And so Carlsen plays b3. There's some lines like this, like from the English opening, where white can ignore the attack on the c-pawn. If he can play rook c1 quickly. Here white has spent some moves on, like, f3 and, hasn't castled yet. So bishop e3 takes, rook c1. Maybe black can, just play like knight a6 or something, and then any kind of discovery, the queen can go to b4, so like knight d5, queen b4, and c7's covered. So maybe it's not such a big deal for black here. So Carlsen plays b3, and then Anand played queen a5. So he's trying to just kind of use this moment where white has not castled yet to just be a little bit of a nuisance and force white to make some decisions. So bishop to b2. He's not really so worried about this pin here. He could do bishop d2, but then the knight on d4 is less well defended. Knight c6. Castles, castles. So this is a normal kind of position. Usually we see black, when his queen is on d7, it's a common maneuver to go back to d8 and then to come to a5 at some point and also make room for this knight to go here. So here Anand just kind of did this in an accelerated version. And this looks okay for black. I think we could say that black is equalized, but this level a lot of times that just leads to a draw, because then both sides seem to play well enough that not much happens, and maybe white stops trying. But Carlsen has a very different attitude. He just says, well, it's a position that might be equal, but it's not all worked out, and I can still try to outplay my opponent. And he wins the game in just another 18 moves. So it's certainly a good practical approach for him. So here, there's a lot of moves that look natural, maybe like king h1 would be a good prophylactic move, avoiding any tricks of the knight on d4. He could also play like knight d5, but that would just lead to a lot of simplifications. Even like a move like knight d to e2 looks kind of natural, just avoiding trades and trying to use the space advantage. But it's not so clear how to follow up. Black can, put rooks on like c8 and d8, and maybe even play for e6 and d5. So Carlsen makes a move that looks funny to me. But it's probably just the still equal. He plays knight c to e2. So no more knight d5 to think about, but black can usually play e6 easily enough in this kind of position. So he's not worried about that, and he just wants to make sure he keeps some pieces on. So rook f d8, bishop c3. Here's another point. He's chasing the queen away. Queen b6. Pinning the knight, king h1, and now Anand makes a nice shot here. And I remember when this game was played, I just thought like black is doing just fine here if this move works, and that is probably true. But there's still a game to play. He plays this great move d5, which if it works is clearly a nice move to play. So the point is that if white takes, say ed, then just knight takes d5. cd, rook takes d5, and black will win back the piece because he has so much pressure. The knight is pinned, everybody's attacking it, and he can come attack it again, even with e5, so he's clearly going to win back the piece and be up at least a pawn, because here he has two pieces. Two pawns for the piece. So white can't really go into that. So he does the alternative to not, open the d file against his queen. Plays knight takes c6. So this hits the rook, so there's no time to take on e4 with an attack on the queen. bc. And now this clever move, queen e1. Taking on d5 would just open the position and wouldn't really, favor white, who's, made these pawn moves, a lot of pawn moves, and black is just opening the position for his well-placed pieces. So this move, queen e1, is quite clever because it gets out of the d-file with a gain of tempo, because this is a threat bishop to a5. So here, Anand, I think, makes a mistake, the kind of mistake Carlsen's very quick to seize on. He played rook d to c8, so just moving stuff away from the king side even a little further. The most natural move is maybe like just a5, which stops bishop a5, and then also a4 is a possibility at some point. Should be a natural kind of pawn play for black. He could also maybe move his rook like to e8 or something that might defend the king side a little better. But a5 looks the most natural to me. And then if white plays like in the game, like with e5, knight d7, and e6, black can play d4, taking on d7, then takes on c3. Taking on f7 is possible, but then he still has to move his bishop. Watch out for like a d3 shot. So, maybe black is okay here. He can play c5 like he did in the game to try to defend this way. And that would also defend the e6 square, which is one of white's plans, to kind of come to look at this square. But the rook is still pretty good on the d-file because it supports the d-pawn. So that still looks, kind of complicated perhaps, but I think okay for black. But in the game, things quickly go downhill. He did rook d to c8, then e5, and he went to e8. If he does knight d7, then e6, and now he can't do d4 because it just takes on d7, hits the rook. And if he takes on e6, just bishop takes g7, king takes knight f4. Getting back the pawn looks very bad for black. Like if knight f8, he can just take on e6. If he does e5, white can even just throw in cd, because if he takes on f4, this queen takes e7. So white gets back the pawn in any case and has, a better structure and, better pieces too. All black's pieces are on the queen side. So instead, Anand goes to e8, then same idea, e6. If he takes on c3, white just recaptures with a knight, attacking d5 and protecting e6. His queen now, so still problems there. So he takes, but then knight f4. And still big problems. So bishop c3, queen takes. He plays d4. He could try to protect this pawn, but he can't really protect it in the long run. White's pieces just come in very easily. So he plays d4. Queen d2. He could also come to e1 and, hit this pawn and, maybe come out this way. But he has a different route in mind. c5. So now black's protecting this pawn on e6, but it's hard to kind of keep it in the long run, as we'll see. So just rook a to e1, knight g7, and now Carlsen comes up with a nice move to really just restrict this knight. He plays g4. So this is a move that maybe a lot of us wouldn't consider because it looks weakening, but all white's pieces are on the king side, and this just kind of cripples black's knight. And, after this, he can maybe even just like double on the e-file, play like rook e4 and rook to e1 and just improve his position. And there's not really so much for black to do. So Anand misses a little idea that Carlsen had lined up. He played rook c6, so he just wants to overprotect this pawn. Probably he needs to try to get e5 in, maybe like with like queen d6, so he can maybe play e5 and knight e6 and get the knight into the game. And then the knight could even come back to f8, which, as we'll see, might might help. After rook c6, Carlsen plays another very clever idea, knight to h3. And this move looks very strange. Like, why would the knight go to h3? But it's very hard to answer queen h6, followed by knight g5, just an old-fashioned attack. So, very hard to answer. I think I heard that Carlsen said like the game was like over at this point. Very hard to defend. So he tried to bring his knight around. Knight to e8, queen h6, knight f6, which defends against knight g5, because h7 is covered at least, so knight g5, d3, trying for counterplay. This is maybe like a decisive mistake. He might even have to like throw in e5, so like rook takes e5. And maybe then he can move this e-pawn at some point to defend along the second rank, but it still looks pretty hopeless. He could also try something like queen a6 to try to get some counterplay here, but I think white will probably play the same thing. So probably Carlsen was right in a sense that like after knight h3, black can't really defend so well. d3, and then a very strong move, probably the only overwhelming move, rook to e5. The d-pawn's not going to just, queen and need support, and the attack is really too strong. So what's the point of this move, rook e5? The threat is really to do knight takes h7, and then he can do queen takes g6, and the rook can come in to the attack as well. So let's say he just tries to support the pawn, rook d8, knight takes, queen takes, and, wherever the king goes, like rook h5 is coming, or if king f8, he can just take on h7 even, so that's just crushing. So there's just not really any kind of good defense to this. So he plays, to avoid queen takes g6 check, he plays king h8. So now knight takes h7, knight takes, queen takes, he would have rook g8. It's not so clear now. Carlsen just plays rook d1, attacking the pawn, queen a6, and now a4, so the queen doesn't have any counterplay, and now perhaps, surprisingly, Anand resigned. There's just not really anything for him to do. White's pieces are all completely dominant. The king side is all tied up. He can't protect the d-pawn in the long run. White can always just kind of come back and take it. He can't play rook d8 even, because of knight f7 check. So white's just going to take on d3, and then he can either double on the e-file and take on e6, or he could maybe even, do something to like double on the d-file, bring his e5 rook back and double on the d-file to do rook d8 check. There's just not really any way to defend, so Anand gave it up. So this is, a short game that starts out very boring, and in the opening it seems, and then black just seems to get his move in and equalize. He gets a d5 in on move 15, but then just a couple moves later, and this is the world champion that's playing black, and the really exact play by Carlsen really punishes Anand. So hope you enjoyed this virtual miniature, and we'll see you next time on chesslecture.com.